Greetings. We want to continue now our discussion of energy and materials flow through an ecosystem. When it really comes down to it, an ecosystem, or at least the community, the biological part of the ecosystem, is really a mechanism whereby matter and energy flows through the structure of life, the structure of the living organisms. We looked the last class at a couple of important concepts that we'll have to draw on today. One of them would be the idea of primary productivity, the amount of energy available to the ecosystem to distribute. And then secondly, the trophic structure of the community, the feeding relationships, what eat what's and so forth, because it's the act of feeding that actually fixes both raw materials and energy. It makes it available to whatever feeds on you. Consequently, feeding relationships are critical to understanding both matter and energy flow through a biological community. Now, we had introduced the idea of primary productivity last time, so let's start there, because that really fixes the amount of energy available to the community for use and to support the various species that are going to be there. Let me get the PowerPoint up for that. Okay. All right, so here's the community structure that we talked about. The producers fix the energy through photosynthesis. We talked about photosynthetic processes and how efficient they are. Then the consumers get their energy and raw materials by eating the producers. And we have several levels of consumers. I don't need to go back and reiterate this because it's pretty straightforward. It was pretty well developed in the previous lectures, I think. This is the structure, the trophic structure, if you will, of the biological community that really is determined by the flow of energy and the raw materials. Both of those are transferred by feeding relationships. Primary productivity, if you recall, was basically what's available to the community to be distributed throughout its numerous trophic structures, right? The bottom line is photosynthesis. That's what fixes the energy from a inorganic environmental source, in this case light, into a biologically accessible chemical source. In this case, it would be glucose sugars that then are used by all other living organisms to provide them the energy they need to run their metabolism and the like. To calculate out, or determine, if you will, the amount of energy available to the community, which is called the primary productivity of that particular ecosystem. We take, as we recall, the total amount of energy fixed through photosynthesis. But we have to subtract from that, and then for a particular plant, the amount of that energy that it uses for its own metabolism. We call that the respiratory loss. General term for metabolism is called respiration. Right? And so plants will use as much as 50% of the energy they fix through photosynthesis for their own metabolism. And then what's left over is then represented in the chemical bonds making up the actual bodies of those organisms. And that's what's available to things that feed on them. Right? So the primary productivity is basically the gross photosynthetic product, the total amount of photosynthesis that a plant does, or that the plant community as a whole does. And from that, excuse me, from that we have to subtract what the plants use for their own metabolism. The rest is what's left over for the rest of the biological community to use, and that's called the primary productivity. If you want to symbolize that, it's very simple. Primary productivity is equal to the total gross photosynthetic product, or the total amount of photosynthesis that's done, minus the respiratory loss, minus what the plant community is using for its own metabolic purposes. Okay. Just like your net profits are equal to your total deposits minus your expenditures. Then what's left over is profit for your business. Okay. We pointed out also that the easiest way to express this, even though we could use calories, which is a good measure of energy, would be of grams of dried vegetation per square meter per year. Those are arbitrary decisions, but it just turns out that the amount of energy that a vegetation contains is pretty consistent. And so if we take a gram of dried vegetation from one place and a gram of dry vegetation from another, though they may have different species, different leaves from different kinds of trees and so forth, there's a pretty consistent amount of energy contained in vegetation. If we were to burn that and measure the amount of energy that vegetation contains, we'd find that it's about 4,250 calories for every gram of dry vegetation. There are slight variations from one place or one type of vegetation to another. Nothing that's terribly consequential. So consequently, the easiest way to measure primary productivity is to harvest the amount of vegetation that grew in a year, perhaps on a square meter, dry it out so you get rid of the water, and then weigh it. You know, for every gram of dry vegetation, that represents 4,250 calories. And so you could express the primary productivity either as the number of calories represented are fixed by the plant community per square meter per year, or simply the number of grams of dry vegetation fixed per square meter per year. Okay. That makes it a lot easier. It's a lot easier to go in and just cut down the vegetation that grew since your last examination, dry it out and weigh it, as opposed to put it in a calorimeter and burn it and measure the number of calories that were put out and do some a little bit more sophisticated calculations. All right, so that pretty much gets us to where we left last time. And now we want to build on these ideas if everybody's comfortable. No question? Okay. Well, one of the things we might want to do then is take a look at the amount of primary productivity that is characteristic of different types of biological systems. Now, there's a terminology change that's occurred here. Now, in the olden days, sometimes you'll read books that still use that term. They'll talk about the different global ecosystems, the desert ecosystem, the temperate forest ecosystem, the tropical rainforest ecosystem, the coral reef ecosystem. And there was a problem with that, because it turns out that an ecosystem is an enclosed entire system. But on Earth, all of various components are to some degree interlinked. There's transfer of energy and raw materials and so forth between the deserts and the tropics through winds and currents, things like that. And so in a more accurate sense, there's a global ecosystem. The entire community of living organisms integrate to some degree or another across the globe, which is one of the reasons you can find an atom of carbon that was once part of Aristotle in a penguin in Antarctica today. It got cycled around and through that. For that matter, we should point out that every one of us today has about 2,000 atoms of carbon that were part of Aristotle. This carbon is cycled around. Don't get too uppity about that, though, because you probably have 2,000 atoms or 200 atoms of carbon that once part of Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun. Hitler hasn't been dead long enough for it to cycle very long, so you probably don't have much of Hitler's carbon in you yet, but you will. Okay. And so biologists have changed the terms now. We talk about biomes, which are basically significant ecological systems within the global ecosystem. And so instead of the desert ecosystem today, we talk about the desert biome or the tropical rainforest biome. And for most practical purposes, the ideas are pretty interchangeable. It's just that the use of the term an ecosystem for a part of the global ecosystem was semantically a little bit problematic. Okay. Now, so what I want to do here is go through and look at some of the common biomes that we have, just to get familiar with them, since it'd be nice to know a little bit about what's going on in the world. And at the same time, take a look at their primary productivity in terms of grams of dried vegetation per square meter per year, the simplest measure, so we can see how they compare. Okay, and you might find some interesting things here. So let's start out with the desert biome. You know, we have a desert here in California, Los Angeles. In California, a desert, we use the word a little bit sloppily. The Mojave Desert isn't a desert. It's really it should be the Mojave semi-arid. But from a climatological standpoint, a desert would be an area that gets less than 2 inches a year of rainfall. Now, there is some confusion here too, because many of the different sciences, physical sciences, use the term differently. You go to a biologist and say a desert is a place that has desert plants and animals. Okay. You go to a geologist and they'll say a desert's a place where you have arid geomorphic features, where the surface has geological features that are characteristic of arid regions, with no specific number of, amount of moisture or precipitation to find that. You go to a climatologist, he'll give you a definite definition. It's about less than 2 inches a year of rainfall, and there are in fact differences between a desert and a semi-arid. You go to Death Valley, which I urge everybody to do. I think we run field trips there on a regular basis. Geology department. I did certainly when I was teaching geology. And you'll see it looks different than it does out in the Mojave. It's the same plants and species of animals are not there. It's a lot more barren. So there are reasons for these differences. They're meaningful. So we're talking about it here, a true desert biome. And what makes a desert is simply moisture. Okay? The Gobi Desert, or Antarctica, is a desert. It gets way less than 2 inches a year of precipitation. But in the Antarctic, the precipitation comes as snow and it doesn't melt. So it piles up year after year. It looks pretty extensive. But it has nothing to do with temperature. They don't have to be hot. They just have to be dry. Now, this lack of water is going to be the rate limiting step to the amount of life that's occurred. It's life needs water. And so we would expect the desert to have a rather low primary productivity. Now, if I have a face-to-face class, which I really would rather have, we can go through here and get people's idea of what they would think a low amount of primary productivity would be. We'll take a guess and take surveys and then see, how close we come, because this is a good way of learning, but we can't really do that in a canned lecture like this. So I'm going to have to get Kate to make some guesses, but she's had some ecological experience, so we'll have to see how well it's taken. So what would you think would be a good primary productivity for the desert?
Let's say 200 grams.
200 grams of dry vegetation per year.
I'll say 100 to 200.
Per square meter. Got to do that, not the whole desert, right? So you can use the square meter is a standard unit that people use. You could talk about grams of dry vegetation per 10 square meters, as long as you're making equitable comparisons. So 200 grams per square meter per year. What that really means is that in a year, a square meter of average desert will produce 200 grams of new vegetation once you dry the vegetation out. You have to dry it because the water takes a lot of energy to boil and evaporate away. And therefore, you would get less energy released as burning, which is what you're measuring, if there's a lot of water in there to evaporate away first. So you dry it out first. Then you burn in the calorimeter of the vegetation to find out how many calories it possesses. Well, deserts vary from as low as 0 to as much as 250. So you're in the ballpark. Okay. Now that seems like a range that's pretty significant. But remember that any geographic system grades from one set of conditions to another. The Atacama Desert in Chile, it rains maybe once every couple hundred years. Right? It's the driest desert that we have. And you may go years where there's really no growth. Okay. On the other hand, if you're going into a desert that's just like the southern ends of the Sahara, that's just ready to morph or to, a few kilometers further south, it would be in the semi-arid type of region, right on the margins of these biomes. You might find conditions that are a little bit more favorable, though still within the realm of 2 inches a year rainfall. So you get between 0 and 250 grams per year. But we got to expect that the lack of water means that this is going to be a rather low number. And it'll give us a model for comparison to look at other biomes and get a feel for how they compare. So what about the tundra? Now, what is the tundra? Right. The tundra is that frozen area up in the north to a lesser degree in the southern hemisphere, because there's not much land in the southern hemisphere. But in Siberia, Alaska, northern Canada, areas up there that had previously been covered by significant glaciers. 10,000 years ago, glaciers would have extended a couple of miles thick all the way down into Kansas and Nebraska, right? And then melted back very quickly. So between, say, 19,000 and 10,000 years ago, the glacial maximums occurred. They have subsequently melted back. But that area, especially up in the northern hemisphere, which is still pretty cold, has something that we call permafrost. I should have written that somewhere, but I'll do it now. Permafrost is just a contraction for permanently frozen ground. Now I'll write this down here as best I can on my little green board. Okay, I don't know if you can see that adequately.
Yeah, nice.
Permafrost, P-E-R-M-A-F-R-O-S-T, permanently frozen ground. And what that means is that when glacial ice was covering those areas, the ground was frozen solid down to sometimes 1,000 meters. Okay. Now, the ground itself, what was really frozen, of course, was the water in the ground. So basically, permafrost is soil and minerals and undecayed vegetation, all frozen in to ice, which is the filling up the spaces in between those materials. Right? And so even though the glaciers have melted back, the ground there is still permanently frozen down to several, in some places, 1,000 meters or so. Now, what happens is every summer in the Arctic areas, the summer is very short, maybe a couple of months long, and temperatures don't get that high. So maybe a foot or two of the permafrost melts, but the water that's melting can't go anywhere because the ice, the permafrost below it's not permeable. So you get a slush of soil and undecayed vegetation and water at the surface. It then refreezes the next winter. Okay? So consequently, the productivity here is rather limited because you don't find that things tolerate being frozen most of the year very well, especially the soil organisms. A little bit later when we talk about nutrient recycling, we're going to see that the whole thing's upside down in the tundra because bacteria and yeasts and molds and all those single-celled organisms that are predominant decomposers don't do real well frozen in the ground. It doesn't really have a normal soil. And so we're going to see that there's a whole different kind of nutrient recycling machine goes on here. But so the fact that it's frozen a good portion of the year. The other fact is it doesn't get very much sunlight. During the summer, there's a period there of a month or two where the sun, as you're north of the Arctic Circle, shines 24 hours a day, but it's very dilute. The sun's coming in at a rather oblique angle. And so the intensity of sunlight is very low, even in the summer. Though you get long periods of sunlight, you only have that for a few months. And then during the winter, sometimes if you're above the Arctic Circle, the sun doesn't even peak up above the horizon. So you got limited light availability, seasonal light availability. You have temperatures that make water available when it's not frozen, but in such good quantity that you have to be special organisms to tolerate growing in saturated soils. And that result, then you'd expect the tundra biome to be high primary productivity or low. What do you think?
I'd say generally pretty low.
Yeah, between 50 to 400. 400 would be at the southern extent in the northern hemisphere where it's just ready to graze into the northern conifer forests. Okay, so that would be where it's at its maximum. Right in the middle of it, it's pretty well populated by perennial plants that can grow and go through their whole life cycle in a month or so. And set seeds that will grow the next season. So it's got a pretty restricted biological community because you can't. Your primary productivity determines how much biological life can be supported in that biome. And the limited amount here means that the total complexity of the trophic system is pretty small. Okay, what about the open ocean?
So when you say open ocean, you mean the
With
deep parts in the middle, not up against any continents.
Yeah, not the shelf.
I'd say it's still kind of on the lower side.
Yeah, oceans are pretty much a desert.
Yeah.
Before to 200. And the reason for that is if you look at the soil, even in if you look at the desert soil, it can be very productive if you bring water to it, right? But it has the nutrients. The open ocean doesn't have nutrients very much. It's water with some salts dissolved in it, but that's about it. And so the nutrients in the ocean maximize at depth. The organisms decay and they rot on the way down, and at about 800 meters down, you have the nutrient maximum zone. But there's no light down there. Okay, so the two ingredients you need to support a plant community and therefore an animal community that feeds on would be light and nutrients. And the plant nutrients throughout most of the ocean are separated by being maximized at a greater depth than the light could penetrate. So it's only the really highly productive places in the ocean are places where those mid-water, nutrient-rich midwaters are brought up to the surface where the light can get at them. Then you get blooms of plankton in the base of a food chain, and that's where the really rich fisheries would be. Out in the open ocean, you're basically getting pelagic fish that are, pelagic means they swim around the oceans from place to place, and are basically migrating from one place where there's productivity to another. The reason I bring this up and emphasize it is that there's these, I see it on TV all the time, especially on the web, where the oceans are going to feed the world. The population is no problem because we have an ocean. The fact is the ocean's productivity is very low. There's a lot of it, so there's a significant amount of food. But the places where it is reasonably productive, you can count on your hand, fingers on your hand. And they've been fished so heavily that the fisheries there have been depleted simply because of over-harvesting. We talked a little bit earlier about how to determine a maximum sustainable yield. And we haven't been using any kind of management techniques throughout history. And as a result, the major fisheries have already been depleted to the point where they may not survive, much less supply abundant food for a growing population. And so this idea that the oceans is a cornucopia of life, of food to support life, is just a myth. It's already being stressed past its capacity to sustain production. We need to reduce the pressure on it rather than increase the pressure. Some of the famous fisheries have gone out of business already, or close to it. When I was a kid, you used to eat fish because it was cheaper than meat. Now you want halibuts, 25 bucks a pound. Swordfish, all these things are way, way more expensive than any other kind of food because we've overfished the fisheries. The resources have been depleted. So the open ocean is not terribly productive in the first place. One of the ironies is the most beautiful waters are the least productive. You see all these posters with these crystal clear waters in the Bahamas and so forth. You go scuba diving and you can see all 100 meters to the water. Well, that's sterile. Life absorbs light. So where you have rich biologically productive waters, it's green and murky because you have all kinds of plankton and zooplankton, that's animal plankton, and plant plankton, and small organisms and big organisms swimming around there absorbing light. So the clearer the water, the less productive it is, which is the irony. When you go to the coral reefs, you see the water themselves is really not supporting very much. The coral reef is a local area that's deflecting nutrient-rich waters up from depth. So it's a little bit an island of life, but it's about the most productive areas in the ocean. Okay, so open ocean, not particularly productive, but same as a desert. All right. Now the continental shelf is the shallower part of the ocean right adjacent to the continents, or the shoulder of the continents. I'll draw my picture here. The shoreline or the edge of the continent isn't where the water hits it. It's where the continent gives way to the deep ocean floor. And so if we looked at a profile off the coast, it looks something like this. Okay. Let's see if we get that across here. All right. So we have the continent here, which is this stuff. That's the continent. All right. The water, it's the shoreline here, hits the edge of the continent, but there's still a shoulder of the continent working out underneath the water. So this is the continental shelf right in here where it's shallow, maybe 100, 200 meters deep, not 12,000 meters deep. Excuse me, not 3,800 meters deep, which is the average depth of the ocean. And it's shallow enough here, shallow enough there that light can reach the bottom through much of it. And so the continental shelf is going to be a lot richer than the open ocean. And the reason for that is it can get some light through much of it. And it's getting nutrients that are being brought in. The nutrients are dissolved in water. They're being brought in by the tides from the ocean side, and they're being dumped onto from the continent by rivers and streams and run off of the continent from the continental side. Of all the parts of the ocean, the continental shelves, which vary in width from maybe a kilometer to maybe 1,500 kilometers in some places. Off the east coast of our country, it's about 200 kilometers or so. But there you can have much more productive marine environments. And most of the world's fisheries come from continental shelf types of areas. Okay. Now, wherever you have upwellings, where you have deeper midwaters deflected upwards to the continental shelves, those are the hot spots, the most productive areas in the oceans, because you have then maximum nutrient levels and shallow enough to get light. Okay, so the continental shelf, about 350 grams of vegetation per square meter, significantly higher than the open ocean. Still not, as we're going to see up there really higher. The Arctic tundra in some cases have a higher situation, not much higher than the desert, but it's much higher than the open ocean would be. Okay. Hopefully what we're getting now, as I see this description or this discussion, is that there are underlying causes for the values that we see here. And by looking at the values, that tells you something about the operations of what's going on in that particular biome. Why is this number there? Because it lacks water, it's too cold, there's not enough sunlight, or If we're looking at some higher productivity ones, which we will do shortly, it would be because those values are different. All right, so all in all, the oceans is not going to be the solution to world population problem. It's already been stressed past this point to sustain what's being asked from it, which is why fish that used to be cheap are now very expensive. And used to eat fish and you couldn't afford meat. Now you eat meat if you can't afford fish because the fisheries have been depleted. And the new fishing that's coming in, by the way, are species that nobody would have thought to eat before. Nobody ate shark until recently. The shark is really gnarly to eat. It's got ammonia in all of its tissues that has to be processed particularly in a particularly complex fashion. So nobody thought about it. The shark is a fish food until the salmon and the halibut and all the desirable fish got to the point in the codfish where the stocks were depleted to the point where they become extremely expensive. The orange roughy is a deep sea fish. Monkfish is an angler fish. We saw a picture of that starting the class. The deep water fish that are very, very sparse. You know, so if you ever looked at a monkfish, you probably wouldn't want to eat it, even though it tastes pretty good. Okay, the boreal forest. Now, boreal means northern. Okay, so the boreal forest would be south of the tundra, where there's these big, dense conifer forests that go through Canada, Alaska, northern Siberia. Okay, and so now we're getting down into an ecosystem or to a biome, excuse me, where there are seasons. They're fairly equitable. We have plenty of water because of the the climatary situations there. So, what do you think the productivity for a northern conifer forest would be?
600.
Between 400 and 1,000. Now, these things are very wide. You know, you go, let's say you started out at the North Pole and you came down through Canada. You'd be in the tundra for 200-300 kilometers. Then you get into the boreal forest. It would start out pretty skimpy. You know, they're just in a situation just above what they could tolerate. I mean, they're just, they could tolerate just barely what the conditions are there. And as you move south, things get better and better because you get longer days, you get more sunlight, it gets warmer. And the boreal forest may be 1,000 miles wide. By the time you get to the southern extremity, things are going pretty well for it. That's where you get the high primary productivity in that part of the forest, right? So you're looking here at a distribution of the availability of things that make life good, and they vary across that geographic area. And then you get into lakes and streams. Okay, the Great Lakes has a nice fisheries in it. Streams, how productive are they?
I mean, I guess it depends on the stream, but somewhat productive.
Well, how and what? The trick here is that, all right, what have we already learned about aquatic productivity? We've learned that clear waters are sterile. Mm-hmm. We've learned that the waters don't hold much in the way of nutrients because they can only hold dissolved nutrients. Soil is solid minerals, nutrients. Even where you have the proper situations, the best situations, up about 350. So that'll give you some grist for the mill of thinking, so to speak, about what a lake would have or a stream.
Would it be similar to a continental shelf in terms of its productivity level?
Let's see, about 500. Okay, that's an average now. It can go from extremes. Some lakes, like Lake Baikal, are crystal clear, very lowly productive. That's in Russia. Other lakes, like the Great Lakes, the water's pretty cloudy because there's plankton and all kinds of interesting life organisms that provide for a food chain there. Okay, so you get a higher productivity in that lake than you would in another. All right, streams, if they're mountain streams, they're pretty sterile, not very high productivity. If you the nutrients that get into a stream come from the stream banks, from the forest floor litter and so forth. It's along the banks, insects and larvae and so forth that can get dumped into the stream or spend part of their life cycle in the stream because there's food out on the land to feed them when they harvest and become adults. And so these are not terribly productive. And the nice clear mountain streams are one of the lowest productive ecosystems or aquatic ecosystems that we have. Give me the Mississippi River, which is just chock full of cloudiness because it's got not just soils and stuff in it, but all kinds of other dissolved contaminants. I won't call them contaminants. Other dissolved materials, natural materials. It's got much more productivity than, say, a mountain trout stream up in the Sierras. And there's an irony too, is you go up higher and higher in the Sierras, the streams have less and less fish in them because they don't really have very much in the way of nutrients. Okay. The insect populations are depleted. The water's crystal clear. It's only been in contact with rocks for a short period of time, so it doesn't have many plant nutrients in it. So, of course, the Fish and Wildlife Department here in California deals with that by flying big airplanes full of fish and dropping them into the streams. And then hopefully people go up and catch them before they starve to death. This is called proper forest management by the natural resource management people, by the way. Okay. What about farms, crops?
I would say that they have somewhat low prime. I mean, obviously it's would be higher than deserts or open ocean, but the fact that we farm one crop at a time and kind of these, you know, spots with nothing in between them, it's at one stage of succession, I'd say it's on the lower side.
All right, you can't use the word succession yet, so we won't say that. But
Sorry.
look at a farm. It's got a row of wheat, space in between them, a row of spindly crops, and that it. Look at a meadow. When every square inch of soil has got some kind of plant on it or another, all growing intermingled together. So the total productivity is much higher there. Crops, strangely enough, have about 600 grams per square meter per year. Varies, of course, from one crop to another, but they're not really very astronomical. They're right in there along with the rather low productivity ecosystem. Agriculture is not a very intensely productive activity compared to nature. And most people would think it's the other way around. All right? Go on and look at other ones. The tropical savanna, those are the things you see in all the safari movies. It's basically a grassland where you have copse of trees of different kinds that occur here and there on the horizon. And so that's called a savanna. And they named the savanna after what kind of tree islands they have in there. If you drive up to, where's Anderson Pea Soup? What's that? That little town up there, Solvang. If you drive up to Solvang and go up through the valley there, you can see something that looks like a savanna. We got sort of golden grasses, and then every once in a while you have a little plot of oak trees here and there and here and there. So it's a mixed kind of situation with trees and local areas, grasses in between. So the tropical savannas are named after the kind of trees. That could be a acacia savanna or a baobab savanna or whatever. But these are grasslands and some trees mixed. How could giraffes live on the savanna? Well, obviously they're not feeding on grass, right? So they're not grazers, but there's these little patches of trees here and there that represent a unique food source for them because they're tall enough to feed off the high branches. Therefore, are not competing with the rest of the organisms there for a food supply. There's actually a ecological pressure that stimulated the development of these long necks because it was an advantage. And so tropical savanna was sort of a mixed grassland forested area between 500 and 1,000 grams per square meter. Okay. In terms of the trees, what we're talking about is the production of leaves and additional wood, things like that that's been laid on for a year. So you'd have to count tree rings and measure them as well as the amount of leaves that are being produced and so forth. But you notice we're going up. Then we get to the temperate deciduous forest. Deciduous simply means temporary. Your baby teeth are called deciduous teeth because they fall out in a place. Most of the broadleaf trees that we have are deciduous. The leaves fall off in the fall. They grow up in the spring. They get spend the summer producing photosynthesis and so forth. Then they fall off. There's a benefit to that. During the winter, the sunlight is very oblique, so you don't have much raw material in terms of energy to produce photosynthesis. And also, you're going to find that the temperatures drop down significantly, so the rates of any biochemical reaction are reduced significantly. The general rule of thumb is that for organic chemical reactions, and pretty much for general chemical reactions, the rate of reaction doubles for every 10 degrees centigrade temperature increase. Very simply, the atoms and molecules are moving around faster and bumping into each other more frequently as you raise the temperature. So every 10-degree temperature increase results in a doubling of the rates of chemical reaction. But the reverse is true. Drop it 10 degrees and the rates of reaction get cut in half. So during the winter, even though the trees are alive, they're not doing much photosynthesis. Their biochemical reactions are very slow and sluggish. And therefore, it makes sense to lose the leaves so you don't have to support the tissue if you're not having very rapid biochemical processes to produce the foods and so forth for those cells that those cells would require. All right, so temperate deciduous forests in the United States, they exist throughout the southeastern forest, Georgia, Alabama, all the pioneer things where they have oak trees and beech trees and chestnuts and all those things, as well as pines and fir trees and so forth, to get further north especially. Those are the temperate deciduous forests. Temperate because they're in a temperate latitudes around 30 to 40 degrees latitude, maybe southern Canada in some places, and deciduous because they are predominated by broadleaf trees where the leaves fall off in the fall. Okay, what do you figure for them?
Let's go big. Let's go 1,500.
1,500,
Yeah.
2,000. They're very productive. They got the best mix. They've got good nutrients because all those falling leaves return the nutrients to the soil rather than allow them to get lost to that particular biome. The temperatures are good. The sunlight days are long in the summer. The winters are not so cold that you would do damage to the plants. So they have a good combination, making them a fairly productive ecosystem. Look at that, 2,000 grams versus 200 grams. All right, that's 100 times more productive than the continental shelf. All right. And what about tropical rainforest?
I would say it's pretty darn high for that one, maybe 2,000 to 3,000.
Tropical rainforests have a strange business. They've got a lot of really desirable characteristics, but then they got some really undesirable characteristics. The desirable characteristics will be, well, they live in the tropics, there's plenty of water, the temperature's always warm. The difference between the warmest and the coldest month along the equator may be half a degree. It's got plenty of sunlight, got the longest days in the year at various seasons. And the net result is everything seems to be just exactly perfect for plants, except one thing. The tropical rainforest soils are the poorest soils that we have anywhere. They've got almost no nutrient, plant nutrients, which are all mineral materials. I believe we talked about that a little bit earlier, didn't we? We talked about photosynthesis. You need to have mineral nutrients for plants.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did. At any rate, the problem here is that plant nutrients are mineral materials that have to dissolve in water because the plants take them in through the root systems, or perhaps their leaves dissolved in the water that they take in. Tropical rainforests are characterized by huge rains, hundreds of inches a year. And what that does, of course, is dissolve whatever will dissolve in water and then wash it away with the rivers and streams. So the tropical rainforest soils have been leached or depleted of the essential plant nutrients to provide them with the sodium, potassium, and nitrogen, and calcium, and all the necessary elements that they need to have to build their biomolecules. So here's the most lush plant community on the earth, growing in the worst soils on the earth. Something's got to be happening here to explain that. Okay. Well, you can't simply bring nutrients to it because they'll wash away as fast as you bring them in. So these make lousy farmlands. That's one of the problems with countries that live in tropical rainforest areas, is that they don't have any agricultural production, except maybe a little slash and burn, which is not where you cut down all the vegetation, burn it, then the ashes of the vegetation have some nutrients for a year or so until they wash away. But the soils are just as bad as they are, worse than they are just about anywhere else. Now, the tropical rainforest itself is adjusted to this. What they've done is realize that the nutrients that are in the tropical rainforest are not in the soil, they're in the organisms. The plants and animals that live there contain the nitrogen and the phosphorus and all the other elements that they require to build their biomolecules. And so what's happened in the tropical rainforest is they've accelerated the turnover rate. They've increased the rate of decay of the decomposers so that they can, when something dies, all of its nutrients get released by decomposition and are available to take right back into the biological community before it has a chance to wash away. Okay, so the rates, the turnover rate for the decay process in the tropical rainforests are huge. The soil biota and so forth like that are extremely active. This was a problem when they first went to the Vietnam War. The boots that the soldiers were wearing had ventilation in it. It was made out of cotton canvas, which lasted about 2 weeks before it rotted through. So they had to go ahead and put in synthetics that nobody had ever seen before so that bacteria wouldn't break it down. But to give you a more practical application or explanation, maybe an example would be about a better term. Let's say we went to up into the Sierras and we cut down a Douglas fir tree with a diameter of about 8 feet, 100 feet tall. Cut it down, and then you sat back and you waited for it to rot and decay and become part of the forest floor litter. You'd come back every year and you look at it, and it would be more decayed and more decayed. But it might take 100 years, maybe even more in some cases, for that tree to decay and rot down to, completely. Cut down the same size tree in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, and it may be completely decayed in 3 or 4 weeks. So what's happening here is the very limited nutrients that are available in the tropical rainforest are turning over so rapidly that you can get a lot of plants because the turnover rate is so high. But that was something that was tough to understand for a while until I got a pretty good understanding of how ecosystems work. Because you do the soil analysis and it would come out worse than anything you can imagine. And so you have all these plants. So that was one of the mysteries that we finally solved. Tropical rainforests then are quite productive. They got between 2,000 and 3,000 grams per square centimeter per year. In fact, they're not quite, but they're one of the most productive of the terrestrial biomes.
Isn't it grams per square meter per year?
What did I say?
Centimeter.
Yeah, grams per square meter. I apologize. Certainly. All right, then we have coral reefs, which are basically the tropical rainforests of the oceans. The coral reefs grow in the tropical areas, which are the nutrient depleted soils. Waters, excuse me. But the coral reefs can exist there because they extend from usually on top of old volcanoes. And so the nutrient-rich deeper waters hit the flanks of those volcanoes and get deflected up to where the corals can get at them. And they have plenty of light and it's warm and everything else. So that's where you get the most productive areas of the ocean and the most diverse. Okay. It's kind of a misperception to call it a coral reef because the bulk of the material in the reef is not coming from corals. They sort of form a skeletal framework of the coral colonies that have a calcium carbonate support structure that supports all these little coral organisms. But that's sort of a network that traps the remains of all the other organisms that live there. All kinds of bivalves with calcium carbonate shells and algae, huge, about half of it, of the limestone in there is algae. Algae, there's certain species of algae that produce calcium carbonate granules to support the cell structure and so forth. And so the coral reef is a real biologically diverse community of organisms, not just coral. But it's the most productive of the marine habitats. It's about 2,000 grams per square meter per year. Well, the most productive of all the ecosystems are salt marshes. And I'll give you the 2 to greater than 3,000 grams per year. Now that's really surprising. When people look at the salt marsh, they think of it as a swamp, like, ooh, it's all stagnant and so forth. And that's not the case at all. It's the most dynamic of the ecosystems, both marine and otherwise. And its benefits from something called an ecotone effect. Come on, I get my little. Okay, an ecotone effect. Ecotone. Ecotone.
Nice.
The ecotone is where two biomes are in contact with each other. And at the margins of biomes where they're in contact, it's always richer than it is within the interior of a single biome. And the reason for that is that you're getting contributions from both biomes right there at the edge. All right. And so the salt marsh is a coastal biome, and though it gets benefits from the ocean and from the land. At high tide, nutrients and so forth come in from the ocean side. At low tide, nutrients and species come in from the land side, and they meet there. So you have an extremely diverse, very rich environment. And 90% of the commercially valuable marine species spend either developed part of their life cycle in coastal salt marshes or eat something that does. So the best way in the world to kill out a fishery is just to take all the coastal marshes and dredge them out, turn them into marinas and condominiums, which is exactly what we've done in California. California used to have one of the world-class fisheries back in the 1920s and 30s. You read John Steinbeck's Cannery Row to get a feel for that. But now, basically, they don't have a fisheries at all, except for sport fishing, which is still rather meager. And the reason for that is that we've developed the entire coastline. So every coastal wetland that was a salt marsh has been developed and turned into Marina del Rey and things like that. And then the net result of that is it has an extended impact on coastal fisheries all along the coastline. So it was once a very rich resource for California, is not. And fishing boats that are anchored in California have to actually go down into Mexico. In Mexican waters usually to catch the fish where they haven't developed it so extensively yet. Okay. All right, so the last thing we want to do is be filling in salt marshes, but we get all kinds of pressure to do that because then you can build condominiums and coastal things, and so the real estate developers want to go in there and turn them all into some kind of development, which is again what happened in California. I think the only uncompletely destroyed coastal wetland would be down Newport Bay, but the Irvine company's building it Back Bay, Newport, but they're busy building along there and filling it in, so that's unfortunate. Okay, so coastal wetlands are extremely important both to marine fisheries as well as productivity of the world as a whole. Okay, well, there's a lot more subsystems, but this will give you some sense for it. And again, you realize that there's a reason that these systems are very productive and these ones aren't. And as an ecologist, you want to go back and figure out what characteristics would make these discrepancies or these differences in productivity occur. Yes, ma'am.
Just a quick question. Is a swamp, just a regular swamp, also an ecotone or no?
Well, swamp is not a definite thing. It's just a generic term for wetlands. So swamps in Louisiana are extremely productive. Much of them are coastal wetlands that are submerged with salt water, high tide, and freshwater at low tide. A lot of them right now are in flux because of changing sea levels and subsiding land levels. So that whole area is whitewashed, doesn't know what it's going to become yet. But we've destroyed one of the best fisheries. It's still a pretty good fishery, but one of the best fisheries in our hemisphere is the Gulf Coast. Right? But we're busily messing with that for developmental purposes as well. So a swamp could be inland. You can have a swamp up in Georgia if you want, which would simply be a wetland that's freshwater. It's not coastal. Right? But they're very productive as well. They're not quite as productive because they're not an ecotone. Fair enough?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I guess I should add next semester terrestrial wetlands on here, which is what a swamp would be. Okay, now we've got some idea here of the beginning points. Here's the amount of energy available to us. What we would like to do now is trace how does that energy and going along with it, the raw materials, pass through the biological community. And to do this, we have to take a look at that trophic structure that we developed, right, before. The producers, consumers, and so forth. Because each one of those feeding relationship steps is the mechanism by which raw materials and energy is passed through an ecosystem. So let me see what our next slide is. Well, that's an interesting thing. That looks like a fish hook, but it should be animated. I think this is a good place for us to take a break for the reason that we can now build on what we did this time and look at how matter gets transferred through a food chain, and I can correct this animation as well. So you got any questions about what we've done today?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, we're going to pick up then by taking a look in a sort of schematic diagram. Is it diagramical? No. In a picture sense of how, a graphic sense, that's the word I want to think of how the flows of energy and raw materials occur and what the limits would be. So we'll see you all then. We'll see you all then at the next lecture, and it will be a pretty extensive one. So you all have a good day or night or whatever.